Shabbat Shalom. We are now just a few days away from Pesach, as this is Shabbat Hagadol, the last Saturday before we celebrate the Passover holiday. I'm reminded of a story of a certain Jewish man who received the very high award in England of being named a knight in the Queen's court. Of course, as you well know, it is a big deal to become a knight, and they don't give that award to just anybody. To be a knight in the Queen's court is really something to celebrate. So sure enough, it was the day of the knighting, and the Jewish man was in line, ready to take his turn. And he watched as each of the knights went before him. And of course, there they would kneel before the Queen. She would touch them with the sword. They would recite a certain Latin formula, then they would rise and be knights. So sure enough, the Jewish man in his kippah is watching all of this happen, each person coming before him to become a knight. When it was his turn, he kneeled down. He was touched with the sword by the Queen. And in that moment, in his great fear and joy, he forgot the Latin phrase he was supposed to utter. So what did he say? Just out of his mouth, without even thinking, he says, "Ma nishtana halayla hazeh mikol halelot." Sure enough, the Queen looked at him, then looked to her advisors, and she said, "Why is this night different from all other nights?" Sorry, I had to. The Passover holiday is before us. We are getting our Seders ready. Many of us are taking time in advance to prep. And of course, the essence of the Seder may be summed up in the teaching of Rabban Gamliel, who says, "B'chol dor v'dor chayav adam lerot e'atzmo ke'ilu hu yatsa miMitzrayim." In each and every generation, the person is supposed to see himself or herself as if he or she came directly out of Egypt, as if they had that experience of slavery into freedom. We understand this message. We Jews have taken it to heart. So many of us on Seder night will take the Haggadah, and we will look at the suffering of our people, and we will compare it to the suffering that happens today. We'll look at oppressed and persecuted peoples around the world, and we'll ask the question, how can we help? Because we know what it means to suffer. We've had that experience. I'm reminded of a story I heard of a certain man who falls into a pit. And now the pit is too deep, the wall's too high for him to climb out on his own. So sure enough, there he's stuck in the pit, and person after person comes by. Finally, he sees someone and he yells up, "Hey, sir, help me out of here." The person says, "Of course, I'm a doctor, I'll write you a prescription." He writes a prescription and throws it down into the hole. The next person who comes by is a rabbi, and the man yells up, "Hey, sir, can you help me out of here?" And sure enough, the man says, "Yes, I'm a rabbi. I'll say a prayer for you." He says a prayer and keeps on walking. The next person who comes by, the man in the pit recognizes this other man as a friend, and he says, "Hey, friend, can you help me out of here?" And sure enough, his friend jumps down into the pit with him. The original guy says, what are you doing? Are you crazy here? I was trying to get out. What are you jumping down into the pit with me for? And his friend said, "Look, I've been down into this pit before, and I know how to get out. And as your friend, I'll help lead the way." We Jews, we know what this means. It says over and over again in our Torah, remember that you were strangers in Egypt. Remember what you went through, so that we can help others out. And indeed, on Seder night, one of the central messages, one of the central ideas of remembering in each and every generation we're supposed to see ourselves as if we came out of slavery, is to know what it means to be enslaved, to know what it means to be oppressed, to know what it means to be persecuted, to know what it means to not have a homeland, to know what it means to go without. And therefore, we're supposed to reach out to those who go without, to those who are in need. That's one of the central ideas of the Seder. But as we come to our Haftarah reading for this morning, for Shabbat Hagadol, And indeed, that's what makes this Shabbat so special. The Shabbat immediately preceding Pesach, we read that special Haftarah that comes from the prophet Malachi, as Elliot chanted so beautifully for us just a couple minutes ago. And the prophet tells us that God looked upon our ancestors some 2,500 years ago, and he said, I see your lack of faith. Here times were tough for you, and so you've relinquished your faith. God, through the prophet, says, when times are tough, we often lose our faith. And all the more so when times are good, we often lose our faith. But God says, watch out. I'm sending the prophet Eliyahu Hanavi, Elijah. He's going to come before, and he's going to herald in this messianic era led by a Mashiach ben David, a Messiah. A time of great peace, a time of great joy, a time when the Jewish people will be able to return to Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, and know true and lasting security and peace, and not just security, and not just peace, and not just freedom, but a restoration of belief in God. That's what our Haftarah is about. That's what it tells us when the Haftarah ends with a reminder that despite our lack of faith, God will still send Eliyahu Hanavi, who will precede the Messiah, who will bring us to peace and freedom and security, and most of all, back to faith. Because the other part of Seder night is about belief. The other part of Seder night is about faith. The other part of Seder night is about hope. It's about saying, just as God redeemed us thousands of years ago, so too can and will God redeem us again. I wonder, as I look around this incredible room, how many of us really have that faith? How many of us really have that hope? Maybe at Seder night, as we remind ourselves to care for those who are in need, we can also remind ourselves to find again that faith and that hope. The story is recounted that David Ben-Gurion, the first Prime Minister of Israel, was addressing the United Nations in 1947, prior to the birth of the State of Israel, in the midst of the appeals for the partition plan. And there in 1947, David Ben-Gurion says to the United Nations, I wonder how many of the British and how many of the Americans remember on what day the Mayflower set sail. And how many of us really know what day the Mayflower set sail? David Ben-Gurion said, but Jews around the world know exactly on what day the Israelites left Egypt. It was the 15th of the Hebrew month of Nisan. And David Ben-Gurion said, how many of us know exactly what meal they ate on the Mayflower? Do the British know? Do the Americans know? They were fleeing something. Do we know what the people who sailed on the Mayflower, do we know what they ate? Well, we sure know what our ancestors ate as they came out of Egypt into freedom. And we eat that very same food some 3,500 years later. We eat it over and over and over. And David Ben-Gurion said to the people of the United Nations, he said, do we know what prayers were on the lips of those people who set sail on the Mayflower? The answer is not really, no. But we know what prayers were on the lips of our ancestors who left Egypt some 3,500 years ago. We know what prayers were on the lips of our ancestors who left Poland and Germany and Hungary some 70 years ago. And we know what prayers were on the lips of each and every members of our family and our friends, our ancestors for thousands of years as they celebrated Pesach over and over again. They're the very same words that we will use to conclude our Seders on Friday night and Saturday night. L'shana haba'ah b'Yerushalayim. Next year in Jerusalem. Next year in freedom. Next year in peace. Next year in safety. Next year in restored faith in God and in observance of the mitzvot, the commandments of our people. As we anticipate Seder night, as we anticipate the holiday of Passover, we have to double down on our obligations, our mitzvot ben adam l'chavero, how we care for our fellow men and women who are truly in need. And part of the Seder night is remembering that we suffered and we know what it feels like, and so we have an obligation to care for others. But the other part of Seder night, the other part of Passover, as Elliot so beautifully reminded us in chanting of the Haftarah, and as this family reminds us in how they've celebrated Elliot becoming bar mitzvah, not just with a perfunctory service, but with a tremendous commitment to Jewish education and to Jewish observance, a commitment to Israel and a commitment to community. The other part of Seder night is restoring our faith in God and our hope that one day we'll be free and secure and safe and faithful in the land of Israel. As we anticipate this Passover on today, this Shabbat Hagadol, may we be renewed in our commitment to care for those who are in need. And may we be rejuvenated in our faith and our hope. Kein Yehi Ratzon, may this be God's will. And let us say together, Amen.